By late 1944, the Allied front is no longer advancing by improvisation or gamble. It moves with a confidence built on logistics, on fuel that arrives when promised, ammunition that never quite runs out, and units that rotate forward already synchronized. Roads are repaired quickly, bridges rebuilt faster, airfields pushed closer to the line. What looks like momentum is, in reality, organization made visible. German commanders study their maps with increasing unease. The lines are not merely bending, they are contracting. River barriers once assumed permanent are crossed or turned. Cities that anchored entire sectors fall in sequence, followed by the junctions that fed them. Each loss redraws the geometry of defense, shrinking options and compressing time. The front does not collapse all at once, it erodes, one connection at a time. Into this erosion, fresh armor is dispatched as a plugging force. Tanks are sent where infantry alone can no longer hold, where gaps threaten to widen into breaches. The intent is not subtle. Armor is meant to restore coherence, to stiffen a line long enough for something resembling stability to return. In earlier years, this logic had worked. A concentrated counterattack could shock the enemy, disrupt planning, and regain the initiative. That assumption still shapes the plan. Tanks, it is believed, can do what they once did, strike hard, force a pause, and impose uncertainty. Doctrine lingers even as conditions change. The memory of success becomes a substitute for current reality. What is overlooked is that the enemy no longer fights as separate arms moving in sequence. The Allies now fight as a system. Air reconnaissance feeds artillery. Artillery shapes infantry movement. Infantry fixes targets for armor and aircraft. Radios compress decision time, turning sightings into strikes with mechanical efficiency. Against this, isolated armor is not a solution, it is a signal. Movement itself becomes actionable information. The tanks, then, are not sent to win the war. They are sent to delay its arithmetic. Every hour gained matters. Every day without a rupture is counted as success. The objective narrows to preventing collapse from becoming immediate and irreversible. Here, the moral tension sharpens. The state still issues orders that imply decisiveness, momentum, and control. The battlefield, however, demands something else entirely: restraint, concealment, and acceptance of limits. Between these two realities, fresh tanks begin to move forward. And when they do, they will discover that the advance they are meant to stop has already been watching their routes. As the new tanks move into the forward zone, the illusion of surprise dissolves almost immediately. The roads they follow are not neutral pathways but recorded coordinates, measured, ranged, and memorized by an enemy that has had time to prepare. Every bend, bridge, and tree line has already been considered for its military value. The tanks advance into a space that has been studied, not discovered. Allied observers notice the movement quickly. From the ground, forward units report engine noise and dust. From the air, the column's progress is traced by shadow and contrast against broken terrain. In this phase of the war, movement itself has become the most visible signature. Stillness offers concealment, motion invites attention. The first artillery shells do not arrive in chaos. They arrive with method. A wide bracket lands short and long, testing distance. Then the adjustments begin, corrections fed back through radios, calculations refined. The intervals between explosions tighten. The crews feel the rhythm change inside their chests before they fully understand it with their minds. Tank commanders scan ahead and to the flanks, searching for the gap they were told existed. Instead, they sense enclosure. This is not an opening to exploit, but a structure designed to absorb and punish entry. The realization settles quietly. They are not attacking into uncertainty. They are driving into a net already pulled taut. One shell finds its mark on the lead vehicle, not a dramatic penetration, but a disabling strike. A track is torn loose. The tank slew sideways, blocking the road. Training takes over. The column compresses, vehicles closing distance to maneuver around the obstruction. What doctrine prescribes as temporary adaptation becomes exposure. The detour pushes the tanks off the firm surface and into the soft margins of the road. Mud grips the tracks, stealing momentum. Engine strain. Heavy machines sink just enough to lose their advantage. Here, mass is no longer protection, it is friction, something the ground itself resists. The shock of first contact arrives without spectacle. The tanks had been sent to stop an advance, to impose terms. Instead, in their very first minutes, they discover they cannot even choose how to enter the fight. And as the shells continue to fall, a harder question emerges: how many more roads like this are already waiting ahead? German leadership still believes, even now, that armor can solve a crisis at the front. This belief is not irrational, it is historical. In earlier years, tanks had restored order where lines bent and initiative slipped. They had arrived suddenly, struck decisively, and forced enemies to reconsider their plans. Memory, in war, is powerful. Past success hardens into expectation. Fresh tanks are therefore treated like medicine. When a sector weakens, armor is prescribed, administered with urgency and faith in rapid effect. The language surrounding these deployments reflects confidence rather than doubt. Reinforcement. Counterstroke. Restoration. The tank becomes less a tool than a remedy, something expected to reverse decline by its presence alone. The plan itself is familiar, almost ritualized. Concentrate the armor. Strike with force. Shock the enemy into pausing. Use that pause to regain initiative and reassert control. It is a doctrine built on speed, mass, and surprise, principles that once defined German operational art. On paper, nothing about the idea appears unsound. What has changed is the environment into which the idea is released. The battlefield no longer rewards concentration, it punishes it. Allied observation by aircraft, forward observers, and radios tied into artillery networks turns mass into a visible signature. What once achieved shock now produces predictability. A concentrated armored force does not arrive unnoticed, it announces itself. Firepower follows observation with mechanical discipline. Artillery is no longer slow to respond or loosely coordinated. Air power is not episodic but routine. Where tanks gather, effects accumulate. The battlefield has learned how to recognize intent before it fully forms. Concentration, once a prerequisite for success, becomes a liability. The crews inside these tanks are not amateurs. They are trained, disciplined, and often experienced. They know how to maneuver, how to fight, how to survive. Yet competence has limits. Skill cannot replace air cover. It cannot conjure fuel where supply routes are bombed. It cannot restore strategic freedom where movement is constantly observed and constrained. Individual excellence strains against systemic weakness. The deeper arrogance lies elsewhere. It is the assumption that a new machine enters the war at full strength, that factory completion marks readiness. In reality, these tanks arrive into a system already collapsing around them. Maintenance units are thin. Recovery vehicles are scarce. Fuel allocations are uncertain. Communications are stressed. A tank's effectiveness is not inherent, it is conditional. By the time these machines reach the front, they are already compromised, not by enemy fire, but by the erosion of the structures meant to support them. The belief in the armored cure ignores this context. It treats the tank as an independent actor rather than as one component in a failing whole. This is where belief hardens into myth. Armor is asked to do what organization no longer can. Steel is expected to compensate for time, space, and air superiority already lost. The tank becomes a symbol of resolve rather than a realistic instrument of change. The stage is now fully set. Faith in the tank's power advances forward, confident in its own history. Waiting for it is an enemy whose greatest strength is not superior armor, but the ability to find, fix, and isolate anything that still believes it can act alone. New tanks do not arrive at the front as finished instruments. They require running in periods, careful adjustments, spare parts close at hand. Gearboxes need monitoring, engines need time to settle, crews need hours together inside the machine before movements become instinctive. These are not indulgences, they are prerequisites. But the front offers no such patience. The tanks are expected to perform immediately, without the margin that new machinery quietly demands. Fuel, once assumed, is now uncertain. Supply routes are bombed repeatedly, rerouted through secondary roads that strain both vehicles and drivers. Tank columns pause not because of enemy contact, but because fuel trucks are late or missing altogether. Recovery vehicles, essential for towing damaged machines, are few and often targeted as deliberately as the tanks themselves. When something breaks, it tends to stay broken. The crews are not always cohesive units. Losses earlier in the war have forced replacements to be assembled quickly, sometimes only days before deployment. Men learn each other's habits inside moving steel, under artillery fire, rather than on training grounds. Commands are issued, repeated, corrected. Small misunderstandings cost seconds, seconds invite attention. Teamwork, once refined through repetition, now forms under pressure. The terrain compounds every weakness. Heavy tanks grind along roads whose shoulders collapse under weight. Craters force detours into fields that look firm from a distance but soften under stress. Wrecks from earlier battles narrow lanes, funneling movement into predictable channels. Every obstacle demands either time or exposure, and often both. Above all, air superiority reshapes behavior. In daylight, movement is a risk measured in minutes. Engines are shut down under tree cover. Columns wait, listening for aircraft before advancing in short bursts. When night comes, it offers concealment but extracts a price, navigation slows, maintenance becomes harder, fatigue accumulates. Crews fight the machine as much as the enemy, wrestling steel through darkness and mud. With each forced halt, the idea of freshness erodes. An overheated engine is not dramatic, but it immobilizes just as effectively as a shell. A broken track does not announce itself with fire, yet it removes a tank from the fight all the same. One by one, small mechanical facts accumulate, turning potential into delay. The war does not care that these machines left the factory days earlier. It measures only function. A tank that cannot move, refuel, or be recovered is already a liability. Clean armor dulls under soot. New paint flakes away. The battlefield equalizes everything quickly. Here, the hard truth emerges without rhetoric. A tank is only as new as the supply chain that feeds it, repairs it, and pulls it free when it falters. And as these fresh machines press forward, the question grows heavier: what happens when that chain breaks completely? The counterstroke is designed on a clean sheet of paper. Timetables align. Arrows converge. The tanks are meant to arrive together, concentrated in space and synchronized in time, delivering a single coherent blow. Doctrine insists that mass, properly applied, creates shock. Shock creates hesitation. Hesitation creates opportunity. It is a familiar chain of cause and effect, trusted because it once held true. Reality interferes almost immediately. The roads cannot absorb the traffic demanded of them. Columns slow, halt, restart. Air attacks scatter vehicles into hedgerows and tree lines, breaking rhythm and sequence. Damaged bridges force detours measured not in minutes, but in vulnerability. Mechanical failures, minor on their own, become decisive when they interrupt timing. The schedule frays, then dissolves. As a result, the tanks do not arrive as a single force. They appear in fragments. One company reaches the assembly area early, engines idling, waiting for support that does not come. Another fights its way forward hours later, only to enter a firefight already decided. Commanders improvise, committing what they have rather than what they planned. Each decision is understandable. Together, they are fatal. Fragmentation invites a particular kind of destruction. Isolated armor does not overwhelm, it exposes itself. Each group now fights alone, not against individual enemy units, but against a prepared combined arms system. Artillery shifts its focus. Aircraft redirect. Infantry closes in. The enemy does not need to defeat the tanks everywhere, only wherever they appear. Here, the deeper miscalculation reveals itself. German planning underestimates the enemy's tempo. The Allies can move effects faster than German armor can assemble force. Artillery fires are retasked within minutes. Aircraft are redirected in flight. What takes hours to coordinate on one side takes moments on the other. Time, once an ally of armored maneuver, now works against it. What was intended as a massed counterattack dissolves into a sequence of isolated engagements. Each fight is intense, localized, and ultimately contained. Success in one area cannot be exploited because there is nothing adjacent to exploit it with. Failure, however, spreads quickly, shaping the ground and the enemy's expectations for the next encounter. The schedule still exists in reports and radio traffic, but it no longer governs events. The battlefield has imposed its own clock, one that favors observation, flexibility, and rapid concentration of fire. Against that clock, staggered arrivals are not neutral delays, they are invitations. The miscalculation is small when measured on a map. An hour late. A bridge out. A D2 taken. On a schedule, these are tolerable. On a battlefield, they are decisive. A strike that is not simultaneous is not a strike at all. It is an offering presented piece by piece to an enemy ready to accept it. The tanks advanced through a narrow corridor of trees and drifting smoke, engines kept low, formations tightened just enough to maintain control. The route has been chosen carefully, hedgerows to break silhouettes, forest edges to complicate observation. It is not concealment so much as denial, an attempt to prevent the enemy from seeing clearly long enough to pass through. Whenever the weather allows, the sky answers. Allied fighter bombers arrive with a regularity that feels procedural rather than dramatic. Their appearance is not sudden, it is anticipated, listened for. Movement draws them in. Columns that pause too long invite them just as surely as those that rush forward. In this phase of the war, mobility is no longer freedom, it is a broadcast. Crews adapt quickly. They learn to halt beneath cover, engines off, then sprint forward in short, controlled bursts. Motion is chopped into fragments measured in seconds. Advance becomes a series of dashes between threats, not a continuous push. Commanders time their movement to cloud cover and gaps in noise overhead, navigating by rhythm as much as by map. Artillery joins the pattern. The route itself begins to feel watched. Shells land first at intersections, then along bends where vehicles must slow. The fire is searching, patient. It walks forward, probing choke points, adjusting to resistance. Even when it misses, it shapes behavior, forcing tanks to stop, bunch, or detour, each adjustment noted and remembered. Infantry escorts move with the column, scanning ditches and tree lines, alert for close-range threats. They do what they can, but their role has limits. Infantry can screen ground, it cannot screen the sky. A tank, by its nature, is visible when it moves. No number of riflemen can change that fact. The first losses arrive without spectacle. A track blown apart by artillery fragments. An engine compartment struck and set alight. A fuel line ruptured, flames licking across armor without penetrating it. These are not cinematic duels between opposing tanks. They are functional deaths, machines rendered immobile, then helpless. Once stopped, a tank becomes a reference point. Fire tightens around it. Aircraft circle back. Anti-tank teams edge closer. What began as damage becomes finality. Recovery under fire proves impossible. Crews abandon or destroy their vehicles, leaving wrecks that reshape the route for those still moving. The struggle clarifies something fundamental. Tanks are not primarily defeated by single, decisive blows. They are worn down by pressure applied across systems, air, artillery, logistics, terrain. Each element alone is manageable. Together, they are suffocating. By the time the column emerges from its first engagement, fewer tanks are moving than entered it. The survivors carry forward not confidence, but awareness. They have learned how this battlefield kills armor. And above them, the sky remains open, patient, and unchanged. As the fighting continues, Allied doctrine becomes visible not as theory, but as routine. The objective is not to defeat the column in a single moment, but to interrupt it at its most vulnerable point. Lead vehicles are targeted first. A disabled tank at the front is enough to block a narrow road, forcing those behind it to slow, stop, or bunch together. Movement is arrested not everywhere, but precisely where it matters. Once the column is constrained, punishment follows with discipline. Artillery revisits the same coordinates, not randomly, but deliberately. Aircraft return in cycles, striking congestion that cannot disperse quickly enough. Each pass compounds the last. What might have been survivable in isolation becomes destructive through repetition. The enemy does not rush. It waits for pressure to accumulate. Anti-tank teams advance toward the disabled vehicles under cover of this pressure. Their task is not to seek heroic duels with moving armor, but to finish what interdiction has begun. A tank that cannot move is no longer a threat, it is an assignment. Charges are placed. Shots are taken at close range. Crews are forced to choose between abandonment and death. The process is methodical, almost administrative. German crews respond with adaptation. Smoke screens are laid to break observation. Alternate routes are probed along hedgerows and across open ground. Tanks disperse into fields in an effort to deny the enemy concentrated targets. These measures are intelligent, learned quickly, and executed under stress. But the battlefield has already anticipated them. Fields are often mined or deceptively soft, swallowing weight and immobilizing tracks. Alternate routes are not unknown. They have been watched, recorded, and registered for fire. Dispersal reduces the damage of a single strike, but it also fractures mutual support. A tank that breaks down away from the road is harder, not easier, to recover. Isolation replaces exposure as the dominant risk. Recovery itself becomes nearly impossible. Towing a heavy vehicle under artillery and air attack demands time that cannot be spared and vehicles that cannot survive the attempt. Each disabled tank becomes a fixed coordinate, a point around which fire can be organized. The battlefield remembers where it is. So does the enemy. What emerges is not chaos, but a system designed to deny renewal. Damage is not meant to be repaired. Losses are not meant to be temporary. The environment is shaped to prevent recovery, ensuring that every mechanical failure becomes permanent. The listener begins to understand the trap. Freshness assumes the possibility of repair, regrouping, and return. This battlefield offers none of those things. It is designed not merely to destroy tanks, but to ensure that once damaged, they never fight again. And as the Germans struggle to adapt, the question shifts from how to break through to something far more urgent: how long any of these machines can remain functional under a method built to erase them one by one. Inside the tank, the war compresses in 2 seconds. A driver feels the transmission hesitate, just a brief resistance under the foot, a sound slightly out of rhythm. It is a small mechanical irregularity, something that would matter little in peacetime. Here, it becomes delay. Delay becomes exposure. By the time the hesitation is acknowledged, the machine has already fallen behind the movement it depends on for protection. The commander stands half exposed in the hatch, eyes scanning for threats that now come from every direction. When fire arrives, it forces an immediate calculation. Stay in position and return fire, risking immobilization. Or abandon the tank and save the crew, surrendering a weapon meant to hold the line. The decision is measured not in doctrine, but in seconds. There is rarely time to reconsider. Inside the turret, the loader continues to feed shells. Smoke thickens, stinging eyes and burning lungs. Alarms sound. Training takes over where judgment hesitates. Routine becomes the last form of control available. As long as the gun fires, the tank still exists as a fighting unit. When the gun stops, everything changes. When hatches open, the world outside is abrupt. Infantry and medics move toward the tank without ceremony, pulling men free with practiced urgency. Hands grip arms slick with oil and sweat. Fresh tank is revealed for what it is, a steel shell containing fragile bodies. New paint offers no insulation against heat, shock, or fear. Radios crackle continuously. Requests overlap and repeat. Fuel needed. Tow required. Air cover requested. Coordinates transmitted again and again, each time with less expectation of response. The network is saturated, the answers delayed or absent. The front speaks faster than the system can reply. Each destroyed or abandoned tank leaves more than wreckage. It removes a crew trained together under pressure. Experience drains away with them knowledge of terrain, timing, and survival that cannot be quickly replaced. On paper, vehicles can be reassigned. Crews cannot. The arithmetic of loss is uneven, favoring the side that loses time rather than men. As the battle continues, these micro-moments accumulate. No single hesitation decides the outcome. No single choice explains the collapse. It is the sum of small failures, mechanical, human, systemic, that erodes the unit's ability to function. The tanks still appear formidable. The crews are still determined. But the margin has vanished. The struggle deepens here, not in grand maneuvers, but inside steel compartments filled with smoke and noise. Machines can be replaced in reports and requisitions. Competence cannot. And as the radio traffic fades into static, the question shifts again from how long the tanks can fight to how many trained crews will remain when the fighting finally pauses. Over time, the movement patterns become clear. Allied observers, on the ground and in the air, no longer see isolated contacts, but a recognizable problem. The fresh tank battalion is identified not as a surprise, but as a recurring presence with habitual routes, predictable pauses, and limited options. What was once uncertainty hardens into knowledge. With each engagement, Allied artillery grows more efficient. Fire missions tighten. Coordinates are reused and refined. Guns that once searched now strike with confidence. The battlefield learns. Every shell that lands teaches the next one where to fall. Experience compounds on the side that can afford repetition. Airstrikes narrow their focus. Bridges are hit not for spectacle, but for effect. Junctions are cratered repeatedly, denying flexibility. Fuel vehicles become priority targets, struck far from the tanks themselves. Mobility is attacked indirectly, endurance quietly undermined. A tank without fuel is already defeated, even if its gun remains intact. German commanders attempt to reform the attack. Orders are issued to regroup, to concentrate what remains, to restore the mass that doctrine still demands. But reforming requires time to assemble, to refuel, to coordinate. That time never arrives. The enemy purchases it with fire, paying in shells and sorties to deny every pause. When tanks do reach the line, they fight with determination. Individual crews achieve local successes, pushing back infantry, silencing positions, reclaiming ground measured in meters. These moments are real and costly for the enemy. But they are also isolated. There is no follow-on force to exploit them, no reserve to transform success into momentum. Each gain expires as soon as the tank moves on or is stopped. The turning point reveals itself not in a single battle, but in paperwork. Reports begin to change language. Vehicles are no longer simply damaged or delayed. They are listed as missing, abandoned, burned. Categories expand. Numbers rise. The battalions strengthen their roads quietly, entry by entry. This administrative shift reflects a deeper reality. The tanks are not being defeated in a decisive clash. They are being consumed, absorbed into the battlefield through attrition that offers no dramatic conclusion. Steel disappears into ditches, fields, and roadblocks. Crews vanish into casualty lists and re-area hospitals. For the listener, the understanding sharpens here. The purpose of the deployment has inverted. The advance is not being stopped. It continues, adjusting around resistance, learning from contact. The tanks, meanwhile, are spent to slow time, and time is winning. By the moment this becomes undeniable, the counterattack no longer exists as a maneuver. It exists as a target list. And as that list grows shorter, one question remains unanswered: how many tanks can disappear before the front barely notices they were ever there? 11. Climax. When fresh armor meets combined arms, almost equals 570 words. The main engagement erupts without ceremony. Tanks push forward through bursts of artillery fire, engines roaring as shells detonate around them with measured regularity. Anti-tank rounds crack across armor, some glancing away, others striking hard enough to force abrupt halts. The battlefield tightens, compressing action into narrow lanes of advance where every meter is contested. Allied infantry holds its ground without spectacle. There are no dramatic charges, no visible defiance. Instead, there is coordination. Targets are marked calmly. Fire is guided with precision. Gaps are closed before they widen. Infantry does not stand alone, it operates as part of a network, feeding information upward and outward. The tanks are not faced by individuals, but by a system that absorbs shock and redistributes force. German tanks win individual duels. At close range, their guns are lethal. Enemy positions are silenced. Vehicles are destroyed. In isolation, these moments suggest success. But each engagement forces a pause, time to reload, to reassess, to maneuver around obstacles. Under constant observation, pauses invite response. Pressure never recedes long enough to turn local victories into momentum. Immobilizations begin to accumulate. A track blown loose here, an engine stalled there. Burning wrecks appear along the routes of advance, not merely as losses, but as obstacles. Roads narrow further. Detours become mandatory. The terrain reshapes itself under fire, channeling movement into patterns the enemy already understands. German commanders attempt to regain control by ordering a pullback and regrouping. Doctrine still promises that order can be restored if forces are reassembled. But withdrawal proves as dangerous as advance. Pullback routes are now known, observed, and registered. Artillery follows retreating armor with the same discipline it applied to advance. Aircraft return to strike columns in motion, punishing exposure regardless of direction. The decisive factor of the battle clarifies itself here. It is not armor thickness, gun caliber, or crew bravery. It is the enemy's ability to concentrate effects faster than German armor can reposition. Fire arrives before formations can adjust. Pressure builds before coordination can recover. The tempo belongs to the side that can see, decide, and strike first, and then do it again minutes later. German tanks continue to fight with determination. Crews adapt, improvise, and endure. But endurance alone cannot overcome compression. Each tank that pauses becomes a liability. Each detour costs time that cannot be regained. The battlefield offers no space for sustained presence, only brief appearances followed by disappearance. As the engagement grinds on, the imbalance becomes unmistakable. Fresh armor does not arrive into a neutral contest. It arrives into an environment already optimized to erode it. Survival time is measured not in days or even hours, but in engagement survived before immobilization or withdrawal becomes unavoidable. The climax resolves quietly, without a single decisive moment. The fresh tanks cannot change the front because they cannot remain on it. They fight, they damage, they delay, but they do not endure. Combined arms does not need to defeat them outright. It only needs to deny them longevity. And as smoke drifts over wrecked hulls and stalled machines, the front line adjusts once more, barely moved, but still intact, while the tanks that were meant to break it fade from the battlefield almost as quickly as they arrived. Withdrawal does not come as an order carried cleanly down the chain of command. It begins in fragments. Small groups of surviving tanks slip back through smoke and dusk, moving when observation weakens, pausing when engines overheat or aircraft pass overhead. There is no longer a formation to preserve, only machines trying to leave the battlefield before it finishes claiming them. Many never make that choice. Engines fail without warning, worn down by hours of strain and inadequate maintenance. Tracks break under weight and terrain already damaged by shell fire. Fuel gauges drop to empty in places where resupply was planned but never arrived. Roads meant for retreat are blocked by wrecks, some enemy, some friendly, turning withdrawal routes into dead ends. For crews whose tanks can no longer move, The final task is deliberate destruction. Charges are set. Breach blocks are smashed. Fires are lit inside engine compartments. What arrived days earlier with factory paint and intact serial numbers becomes charred steel by intent. These acts are not gestures of despair, they are procedural, learned long ago. Denying capture is one of the last forms of agency left to crews who can no longer fight. Recovery vehicles are largely absent. Some have already been destroyed, others cannot reach forward positions under fire. The heavy machinery needed to tow a disabled tank is as vulnerable as the tank itself, often more so. What cannot be pulled back is abandoned. Over time, these hulks become fixed features of the landscape, reference points for artillery, landmarks for infantry, and later, salvage for the advancing enemy. The unit's roster collapses with quiet speed. Vehicles are crossed out. Crews are listed as missing, wounded, or reassigned without equipment. Replacement tanks do not arrive. Replacement crews do not exist in meaningful numbers. The battalion that entered the front as a coherent force dissolves into administrative remnants scattered across reports and casualty lists. Meanwhile, the advance continues. The front line shifts slightly, absorbing resistance and moving on. Positions change hands, then change again. To the larger campaign, the disappearance of the tank unit registers only as a temporary thickening of resistance, something noted, then bypassed. The front adapts. The war does not pause. What does not reappear is the unit itself. There is no moment of reconstitution. No renewed counterattack. The surviving crews are absorbed elsewhere, often without their machines. The tanks that remain behind do not return to service. Their contribution ends where they stopped moving. This is the completion of the turning point. The state sent fresh tanks to stop time to delay the advance long enough for something else to happen. But time is not held by steel alone. It moves according to systems, momentum, and capacity. Here, it moves forward without interruption. In the end, almost none returned. Not because they refused to fight or because they lacked courage, but because they were committed to a battlefield that no longer allowed recovery. The tanks were consumed not in a single catastrophic moment, but steadily, methodically, until their absence became more noticeable than their presence. And as the smoke clears and the roads are reopened, the wrecks left behind tell the final truth of the deployment. They were sent forward to stop time, and instead, time passed through them, leaving only steel where momentum once stood. After the fighting moves on, the work of accounting begins. Staff officers gather reports, annotate maps, and compile numbers into columns meant to impose order on what has just occurred. Losses are sorted by category: destroyed, abandoned, missing, repairable. Dates are entered. Grid reference is noted. The language is procedural, precise, and deliberately restrained. Catastrophe is translated into figures that can be forwarded up the chain. Yet behind every number is a human residue that the ledger cannot contain. Burned hands treated hastily in aid stations. Concussions that leave men quiet and unfocused for days. Shock that does not register as a wound but follows survivors long after they leave the front. And then there are the missing names, lines left blank or marked pending, their absence more unsettling than confirmation. German command confronts a reality it has faced repeatedly by this stage of the war. Replacement, once assumed, is now an illusion. Factories can still produce tanks, but crews cannot be regenerated at the same pace. Training pipelines are thin. Experience is irreplaceable. Each loss recorded is not temporary attrition, but a permanent subtraction from future capability. The reports reflect this imbalance indirectly. Equipment shortfalls are noted with the expectation of eventual remedy. Personnel gaps are acknowledged without solution. The ledger grows longer, but the pool from which it draws shrinks. What once might have been a setback now registers as erosion. On the other side of the front, Allied units review the same engagement from a different perspective. For them, the outcome is confirmation rather than surprise. The battle reinforces a doctrine already tested and refined: armor, no matter how new, can be neutralized through system pressure applied patiently and repeatedly. No single arm is decisive. It is the coordination that matters. Lessons are logged and disseminated. Routes that worked are noted. Timings refined. The wrecks left behind are studied not with awe, but with professional interest. Each burned tank becomes a data point validating method. There is no triumphalism, only quiet affirmation that the system functions as intended. The battlefield itself offers a more immediate verdict. New wrecks litter the ground, indistinguishable from older ones within hours. Soot coats steel uniformly. Fresh paint blackens and flakes away. Serial numbers vanish under fire damage. What arrived days earlier as evidence of industrial effort now blends seamlessly into the debris of earlier campaigns. The ground does not distinguish between past and present loss. As engineers clear roads and infantry advances, the front line continues to move. Resistance is absorbed, bypassed, or reduced. The sacrifice made to slow the advance registers only briefly, a temporary thickening of opposition before momentum resumes. The war's larger motion remains unchanged. This indifference is not cruelty, it is scale. At this level, battles are evaluated for effect, not intent. The tanks did what they were ordered to do. They fought. They delayed. But delay alone does not alter direction. It only consumes resources to purchase time, and time is valuable only if it can be transformed into something else. Here, consequence settles fully. The fresh tank gamble is revealed as another subtraction from Germany's future. Steel is gone. Crews are gone. Experience has drained away faster than it can be replaced. What remains is a thinner force facing an enemy whose capacity grows with each engagement. The ledger closes on this episode with neat handwriting and official stamps. It will be filed, referenced, and eventually archived. But its meaning extends beyond its pages. It marks a point where effort no longer converts into advantage, only into delay measured against an enemy that can afford patience. In the end, the numbers do what they were meant to do. They simplify. They conclude. They state, without emotion, that fresh tanks were sent forward and did not return in meaningful strength. And in that quiet conclusion lies the deeper cost, not just what was lost, but what will never again be available when the next order arrives. This episode reveals a structural mismatch that no amount of effort can conceal. Germany can still produce tanks in late 1944. Factories continue to turn out hulls, engines, and guns, each bearing the marks of industrial skill refined over years. What cannot be produced at the same pace is the environment those tanks require to function: secure movement corridors, reliable fuel delivery, layered maintenance, and recovery under fire. Fresh machines are delivered into a system that can no longer keep them alive. Air superiority changes the meaning of armor itself. Tanks were once conceived as spearheads, able to break through and exploit weakness by their own momentum. Under constant Allied observation, they become something far less autonomous. Every movement is tracked, every pause noted. Fuel consumption becomes a liability rather than a calculation. Armor shifts from being an instrument of initiative to an object of logistics, valuable, heavy, and increasingly exposed. Combined arms completes this transformation. Artillery fixes tanks in place. Infantry denies close terrain and approaches for recovery. Aircraft return again and again, not seeking dramatic destruction, but cumulative effect. No single element needs to dominate. Together, they ensure that isolation is fatal. Even the most advanced tank, once separated from support, becomes expendable. German doctrine struggles to adapt fully to this reality. It still seeks decisive counterattacks, moments where concentrated force can restore initiative in a single stroke. But decisive action requires reserves that remain intact after contact. Here, the attempt to create decision consumes the very forces needed to exploit it. Each counterattack erodes the capacity to hold ground afterward. This failure is not rooted in the crews. The men inside the tanks fight with skill and endurance. They adapt quickly, improvise under pressure, and maintain discipline inside machines that offer little margin for error. Their competence is real and deserves recognition. But competence cannot overcome structure. Skill operates within limits, and those limits are now defined by air power, logistics, and time. The moral irony is understated but severe. The more precious the tank, the more complex and difficult it is to replace, the more catastrophic its loss becomes. When such a machine is immobilized and abandoned, the loss reverberates beyond the battlefield. A rare asset disappears in minutes, offering no lasting return on its investment. Freshness, under these conditions, loses meaning. New paint does not hide movement. New engines do not restore fuel security. Thicker armor does not guarantee recovery. These tanks arrive newer than those before them, yet they enter the same constraints and meet the same end. The battlefield does not reward novelty, it rewards endurance. From this emerges a lasting lesson. Modern war is not decided by production alone. Industrial capacity matters only when it is matched by operational conditions that allow equipment to function over time. When movement is denied, supply lines are fragile, and recovery is impossible, production yields only temporary resistance. The legacy of this episode is therefore broader than the fate of a single unit. It illustrates a turning point where design and manufacture can no longer compensate for strategic imbalance. One side replaces losses faster than they occur and protects the systems that sustain them. The other produces impressive weapons that cannot be preserved long enough to matter. As the war continues, this pattern repeats. Fresh units arrive, fight briefly, and vanish. Each repetition widens the gap between effort and effect. By late 1944, freshness is no longer a strength, it is a fleeting condition measured in hours. In the end, freshness was never enough because the war no longer rewarded arrival. It rewarded survival within a functioning system. And for Germany, that system had already collapsed, leaving even the newest steel to face an old, unavoidable fate. The story returns to its beginning. Clean armor under grey light. Fresh paint catching a dull reflection of the sky. Engines idling, crews standing beside machines that still look untouched by history. The image once suggested possibility, an idea that something new might interrupt the pattern of loss. Now, the same roads tell a different story. Burned hulls sit in ditches and at crossroads, their silhouettes familiar, their surfaces blackened and flaked. The contrast is complete. What arrived pristine has become indistinguishable from the wreckage it joined. The promise that accompanied these tanks was never extravagant. They were not expected to win the war. They were sent to stop an advance, to restore balance, or at least a slow collapse. Yet they arrived into a battlefield that had already evolved beyond such expectations. Momentum here was not held by courage or material alone. It was enforced by systems designed to deny movement, punish concentration, and prevent recovery. The tanks were not late. They were misaligned with the war they entered. The enemy did not need to defeat them in noble duels. There was no requirement for dramatic confrontations between equals. The task was simpler and more efficient: prevent the tanks from functioning as a unit. Stop them on the roads. Separate them into fragments. Destroy or abandon them one by one. Against this method, individual strength mattered little. Longevity mattered more, and longevity was denied. Almost none returned becomes the final verdict. Not as an accusation, but as an accounting. It captures the outcome of late-war improvisation, sacrifice without strategic leverage. Fresh resources were committed into conditions that could not preserve them. Effort was expended not to change direction, but to delay the inevitable by days measured against years already lost. The human cost of the delay is stated plainly. Crews who left factories believing in the promise of new steel met the front's arithmetic instead. Training, skill, and endurance were tested not against a single enemy, but against a system that consumed them quietly. Some survived the machines that burned around them. Many did not. Those who did carried forward the knowledge that survival had become a matter of timing rather than triumph. From the historian's distance, the lesson settles without drama. Technology can delay defeat. It can complicate an enemy's plans. It can impose cost. But it cannot reverse a system already collapsing under its own constraints. When air superiority is lost, logistics are fragile and recovery is impossible. Even the finest equipment becomes temporary. There is no condemnation here of those who fought. The crews did what was asked of them. The machines performed as designed. The failure lay not in execution, but in context. Steel was asked to compensate for time, space, and momentum already surrendered. It could not. The roads where these tanks were destroyed would soon carry other vehicles, other columns, other armies moving in the opposite direction. The wrecks would be pushed aside, salvaged, or left to rust. Their presence would fade, but their meaning would not. They stand as reminders of a moment when production still existed, but advantage did not. In the end, this episode is not about tanks alone. It is about the limits of renewal in a war that no longer allows it. Freshness becomes a fleeting illusion when the environment cannot sustain it. New steel inherits old fate. They sent fresh tanks to stop the advance, yet the advance turned them into wrecks before they could even become a force.